This delightful beast is a maned wolf. He loves to eat apples and look like a fox on stilts, and as soon as I saw him, I had to make him low poly. Let's get started. Now, maned wolves have these unusually long, beautiful legs, and the proportions are a little strange, so I thought it would help to just sketch them a little. Clearly, I needed a little bit of help, so I tried tracing these photos of maned wolves so I could just break down their silhouette into more simple shapes that I'd be able to recreate later when I was actually working on the 3D model. Again, they have these really unique, goofy, and at once elegant proportions that I knew would be a challenge to recreate, so tracing these photos and then copying those shapes down into a sketchbook just really helped me internalize the contours. Safe from the world of drawing two-dimensional creatures, back to 3D modeling. Our good friend Default Cube is here to kick things off, as always. Lately, when I am starting a 3D model, I've found it really helpful to switch up my transform orientations and pivot points lately. So global orientation is the default in Blender, and when I want to move maybe one edge loop or a section of vertices in one area, I find it really helpful to switch to normal orientation instead of global orientation. This allows me to move that selection along the X, Y, and Z axes specific to that selection instead of the default global X, Y, and Z orientations that never change. The absolute snout on this model early on, I'm a huge fan, he looks delightful. I have this skeletal reference up in the top left so I could try to keep things generally accurate from the start, and I think that effort actually did really pay off by the end of the process, but in the early stages here, it does look like kind of a cursed sort of task. The head shape would have been a lot easier to get right if I just looked at that skull a bit more. There's a very smooth slope from the top of the head down to the snout for a maned wolf. I didn't really need to make such a distinction between the nose and the head the way that I did. I felt like tracing the reference photos helped a lot with plotting out the initial blocking of these forelegs. I always struggle with modeling legs. I'm a shark. Hello. I don't know how they work, but I think I had a better idea of the general contour I should be going for after I trace those references, and I need to do something about, there we go, we've added some paws. Our maned wolf kind of had hooves for a moment there, but not to worry. The hind legs are something that I will revisit constantly throughout this entire modeling process for this guy. I struggle with hind legs in general because the proportions are just hard for me to understand for whatever reason. I just need to practice modeling more, really, is the reason. When you're modeling paws or feet like this and need to make sure that they're exactly level, I like to just select all of the vertices on the bottom of the paws, and then I just press SZ0, and that'll scale the selection along the Z axis so they're all level with each other. The more you know. The length of the torso here is very scary to me. It looks frighteningly human at this point. I can't quite explain it, but it is very scary for me to look at, but adding the eyes helped a little bit, looking a little bit more maned wolf plausible now. First, retopology. So after blocking out the basic shape with my beloved Default Cube, it was really boxy and clear that it would be difficult to salvage to make a good place for the eyes, the mouth, the legs. So I started over with a cylinder multiple times, in fact, but I cut those other attempts out. But starting over with this cylinder to kind of do a little low poly retopology here hopefully gives me a better chance at extruding out the legs in a way that looks very natural, because they need to be able to come out of both the sides and the bottom of the body at the same time so I can get some definition of the elbow at the top of the forelegs. And I'm really happy with how the legs ultimately turned out for this model. The forelegs did end up having pretty clearly defined elbows, which is always very difficult for me, but they turned out really nice on this model. I think it's largely because I knew that maned wolves have such distinctive legs. I was maybe kind of like fixated on how that was going to work from the beginning anyway. But yeah, you can see, so for this model, I extruded the legs out in this way where I sort of like arranged the vertices in the way I wanted them to connect to the body, then extruding the legs out. And that worked really nicely. Normally, I just select 1 or 2 faces that the legs will kind of grow out of and extrude the legs out from there. Then I'll go back and try to make the connection to the body look more natural afterwards, and arranging the vertices so that the legs come out of the body at a more natural angle on both the sides and the underside of the body works much, much better. Oh, I just remembered, I'm sorry my screencast keys are turned off for some reason. I don't know why this keeps happening for me, but every time I open Blender lately, my screencast keys add-on is simply turned off for no reason, so you can't see my keystrokes and what I'm doing with the mouse for whatever reason throughout this video sometimes. I'm trying to remember to make sure it's always turned on before I screen record in the future, but that's why it's like that. For the hind legs, you can see that I'm setting up the vertices where I want them to be before extruding out the rest of the legs, just like I did with the forelegs, and that approach works really well again here. Shocking news to me that it's better to just do better work in the beginning instead of trying to clean up worse work later on. Crazy information. I think one of the most difficult things though about modeling hind legs on a quadruped like this, other than just getting the proportions right, is finding a good reference. So I want a model to be in a neutral pose so I can rig it well later on. Wild animals aren't just always standing around at a totally relaxed, neutral kind of pose, so it's not always easy to find a good reference to just follow along one for one. It really takes some effort to figure out. You really have to be able to think about how their legs move, and therefore, what would it look like when it's in a neutral sort of position? One of my favorite moves in all of 3D modeling. When I model paws, I like to just select all of the vertices of the front paw that I've finished, duplicate them, scoot them back to the hind leg, and do a little surgery to reattach that duplicated paw. I always feel like paws are kind of hard to get right for whatever reason, so usually if I get one set of them done well, I'll just reuse that exact same paw on any remaining legs. Once I have the base model finished, I forgot the tail, but we'll get back to that. Oh, and also the ears, but we'll get back to that. I like to go ahead and just add the eyes to help me figure out how I can get the head and the face to start taking shape as I start to refine the base model and work toward more detail. Here I remember to add the tail. I think the tail is really funny the way I initially modeled it here. So you can see in the reference in the top left that the tail that I'm modeling does follow the shape of the tail in that reference pretty exactly, but the maned wolf's tail is only shaped like that in the reference because they're actively walking, so it's moving a bit. Normally, maned wolves' tails look pretty limp and just kind of hang straight downwards, so that'll need to get fixed before I start rigging. It's very similar to what I mentioned earlier about how I have difficulty modeling hind legs because animals usually aren't just standing around in these perfectly neutral positions that we want to model for rigging purposes. You just have to be careful that you're considering the movement in a reference photo before you make artistic decisions based on that reference. Maned wolves are bizarrely thin. They're shockingly narrow creatures, and I've gotten criticism of canines I've modeled in the past for being too wide and just looking more like dogs, so I tried to be mindful of that here. I had to kind of just scale the whole model in a little bit overall and bring the legs a bit closer to each other as well. Our maned wolf is currently earballed. He has no ears to speak of, so let's go ahead and give him some ears. I'm really happy with how the ears actually did turn out for this model. Like plenty of canines, maned wolves have very expressive ears that convey a lot about their internal states. So I wanted to make sure that the model could have flexible ears, and normally to have a part of a mesh that's very bendy and flexible, you need lots of loop cuts and add more topology, which is perhaps not a great fit for low poly modeling. So instead, I decided to just make the ears a separate piece of mesh that seemingly blend right into the model because they share the same material. So they can move freely and have all of that expressive kind of flexibility without having any weight painting concerns. Right now they have kind of like a mouse kind of thing going on, but we'll fix that later. I go back and I start adjusting the tail a little bit here in a second. It's interesting because I guess just because of domestic dogs, I just associate canines with having very expressive tails that have lots of emotion, but I don't know if I've ever really seen any videos of maned wolves actually moving their tails very much. It seems like they're pretty limp most of the time. You can see the reference I have pulled up where the tail is in that more neutral, relaxed position. A moment of realization, I fixed the tail. I also had to lower the head quite a bit. So maned wolves stand with their heads held up high like the model was originally when they're interested in something or alert, but typically when you think of a maned wolf, you're probably thinking of the posture that you see in photos more often where they're walking or kind of stalking around with their heads lowered. So I decided to keep the head lower for the model because of that. I wasn't totally satisfied with the shape of the ears that I'd modeled. They needed to just have much more of an inward curve to them, so I eventually just made a new pair of ears from scratch by adding a plane to my scene and merging all the vertices of that plane at the center. So then I would just have one vertice that I could kind of extrude out and use that to just make a rough shape that I could build out for the ears. And I think the actual difference in the overall shape is pretty subtle, but I do think it actually added quite a lot to the model. Of course, once I finished modeling the ears, I had to take them out for a little test drive here to see how they'd look when the maned wolf was doing different expressions, when they were sad or scared or fighting or something. I think they turned out really cute. I knew I'd want the mouth to be able to open for various poses, so to finish the base model, I just needed to add a lower jaw, which was simple enough really. I just selected the edges where the mouth should be, and I used tear selection to sort of rip the mesh in half and create an opening for the mouth. After that, I just had to kind of extrude those vertices out to create the inner surfaces of the mouth. And I always have to be careful with the outlines when I model a functional mouth like this, because by default there will be outlines tracing all those edges along the inside of the mouth, along the interior, and they'll be the same thickness as the outlines on the outside of the model. So if I don't keep that in mind, those outlines that crop up on the inside of the mouth will just clip right through the model and make everything look very crazy. So I just go into my vertex groups and remove the outlines that appear on the inside of the mouth. The last little detail that I did for this base model here was I just added an extra loop cut along the bottom of the forelegs to add the actual wrist of the foreleg, and I think that added a lot to the model. I could have definitely optimized the topology a little bit better by merging some vertices there, but oh well for now. Once the base model is finished, I find it helpful to go ahead and just start blocking out the general colors that I'll want to paint on when I start texturing in the next step. It just helps me start to look for any places that I haven't noticed problems in the anatomy or maybe shapes of the different parts of the body. Like I'm looking at the tail right now, definitely needs some work. It is extremely fluffy and it will need to be a lot thinner and longer later on. But again, once I start adding just these really basic colors, it just helps me, like that added level of detail, I think just kind of starts to help you figure out what's missing. Like I added a little extrusion at the very edge of the snout just to give a little bit more impression of an actual nose on the end of the snout. Again, that's another thing, very small, but it really helps me figure out and start to plan ahead for, okay, how am I going to texture the muzzle when we get to that in a little bit. Now this whole time you might have been thinking, Sneep, why does our maned wolf lack a mane? And the answer is because I forgot. So let's go ahead and give him a mane. Maned wolves have this beautiful crop of dark hair along the back of their neck and shoulders. A lot of the time you'll see it lying pretty flat in most photos and videos where maned wolves are just relaxed, hanging out, but it will raise when they're maybe more alert or they want to appear larger and more intimidating, like if they smell something dangerous. I think it's pretty much the same probably as a dog's hair kind of standing up on their neck when they're barking at something, that kind of thing. My maned wolf, of course, lives a very relaxed, comfortable life, so his mane would probably always lay flat most of the time, but the mane is a very iconic part of their silhouette, so I wanted to make sure that it's visibly part of the model. I did try a couple different approaches for how I'd actually create the mane. Initially, I just added a cube and moved it around as needed to make kind of a fluff or hair shape along the back of the neck, but it was hard to make it look like it wasn't completely disconnected from the body, so I tried adding a bunch of cuts that would allow me to make a shape key that just raises the vertices along the back of the neck when I wanted the mane visible, and then lower them back down to a relaxed position as desired, but both solutions, in my opinion, looked bad, so I gave up and started marking seams for UV unwrapping instead. As always, I am skating down the path of least resistance with UV unwrapping. I'm only taking consideration to mark good seams that'll unwrap evenly in areas where I know I'll want to texture paint. So the tail, the legs, the belly, the underside of the neck, the face. Everything else is very haphazard, and don't ever replicate it, it's bad. Once I arranged all the pieces of my mesh onto the UV map, it is time to texture paint. The texture painting is simple enough. As always, for a maned wolf, I mainly needed to focus on painting their legs and their face more than anything. Really, the markings on the actual texture were pretty simple. The hardest thing was getting the actual colors right, and you can see I'm actually mostly painting directly onto the model, but sometimes I find it helpful to paint onto the actual texture over on the left in the image editor in Blender. It's helpful for things like painting on legs when they're curved. It can be hard to do that accurately on the model. This is my favorite detail in the texture painting, their little toe beans. Maned wolves actually have these really unique little paw pads. Their two middle toes are actually fused together. I'm trying to remember which other canines have those two fused middle toes. I think I saw on Twitter that it's maned wolves. I think it's also jackals and maybe painted wolves also have those fused middle toes like that, and I didn't find much about why we think maned wolves kind of evolved that feature on their paw pads. I read one thing on Reddit, my incredible sources, Twitter and Reddit. Some post on Reddit was talking about that feature in painted wolves and said that it was thought to be because it gives them an advantage in terms of their stability and balance. So possible for maned wolves. The current version of the mane is built into the topology on the neck and is controlled by a shape key that'll raise or lower those vertices to either show or hide the mane. I just painted the dark section of fur right onto the neck, and when it was raised, it just looked a little Stegosaurus, so I decided to make the mane just be a separate part of the model, a separate piece of mesh, instead of building it into the neck like that. I just wasn't a fan of how it looked. Getting the color palette right was a really big challenge for this model. My colors are usually pretty saturated, and my maned wolf colors looked too neon, too highlighter looking. So here I am in Photoshop with a screenshot of my maned wolf Pinterest board and the color picker tool. Maned wolves have this beautiful sort of auburn color to their fur, and something too neon was not going to be able to capture that at all. So I found a couple different colors to try from these reference photos and just opened my texture in Photoshop and selected all of the orange on my texture and filled in all of that area with the new, darker, maybe less saturated color of orange, and that worked really well for this model. We're slowly getting closer to a maned wolf, so I think the model was looking pretty good at this point, but there was just something about it missing. It just didn't look like a maned wolf to me for whatever reason. Part of that was the shape of the head and the position of the ears. I basically needed to close the difference between the ears and the eyes a bit more. Their ears are really huge, and I just needed to flatten out that slope of the snout a bit more. That made a huge difference. At this point, I did need to kind of start over on the texture painting, unfortunately. It would have been possible to salvage the old texture, but between changing the actual geometry of the model quite a bit and wanting really a different base color again. It'll look a lot better if I just start over with a fresh texture. Editing the texture in Photoshop is perfectly fine, but for some reason my textures always really degrade when I save them in Photoshop. I'm really not sure why that happens, but they always come out looking quite compressed in some areas. Fortunately, my textures are very simple, so repainting them is not a big deal. At this point, I decided I had had enough of the Stegosaurus mane and decided to go back to my original approach, which was just modeling the mane from a flat plane, which worked out a lot better, really. And that's like 90% of 3D modeling, by the way, just doing something one way, changing it for a very, very, very long time, only to go back to the original idea. And with that, it is time for rigging. I set up the rig and deleted it numerous times throughout this process. This was the rig I settled on. It's Blender's basic quadruped meta rig that just comes with Blender built in. I use the basic, so Blender does have an actual like wolf meta rig that you can use specifically for wolves and canines and everything, and it's great. It's super detailed. You can have these great flexible ears. It has all kinds of controls for the face and the eyes and everything like that, but it just, I don't have things for all of those extra bones to control, really. So it just kind of seemed like overkill. So I decided to go with just the basic quadruped rig instead, which I think worked out much better in the end. I did add a couple of extra bones to it though. I just added, there's 3 bones that I added along the neck, and that is just to kind of control movement of the mane. And then I added 2 ear bones, and you can see it, me just checking that everything works with the parenting correctly. But the rigging process for this model was honestly really simple. So I just used the meta rig and automatic weight painting, like most of the time with simple animals like this, where there's not like accessories or clothes or anything. Automatic weight painting usually does a pretty good job in Blender. The only thing I really had to adjust was, like, you can see the eyes are staying perfectly fixed while the head moves around. Not ideal. So I did have to make sure that the eyes were parented to that head bone, and just needed to make sure that the ear bones weren't moving the mane around, so the ears could just move independently and be super cute and expressive just like they needed to be. And then for the mane, I just had to, I like to use the gradient tool in weight painting mode to just smoothen out some of the weight painting for stuff like that, just to make sure that kind of the front half of the mane might dip down when the head dips down, but the back of the mane that is on kind of over the shoulders isn't going to move when just the head moves, stuff like that. And I also added I added that control bone you see at the very bottom, just so I can kind of have one bone that I can just use to move the entire animal around if needed. Making a simple rig like this is also really helpful when I make sticker designs, like right here, what I'm doing now. I can just save and reset poses in Blender's pose library as needed. So for the first sticker design, I knew I wanted to recreate this iconic maned wolf pose. I've seen so many images of them in this sort of posture, where they're just kind of stalking around with their head held a bit low. I also did add a jawbone, so I could pose the mouth open or shut as needed. That also meant I needed to go back and texture the inside of the mouth with some solid red colors, as well as add teeth and a tongue, all that good stuff. I also found this great skeletal reference, and it helped me just try to recreate a very basic version of a maned wolf's teeth. Not that they're even particularly visible on this model. Most of the time, even in the completely finished version of this model, you usually don't see the teeth unless the mouth is really open wide, but it's one of those things that it's not visible all the time, but when it is there, I think it adds a lot to the model. So I'm really happy that I added the teeth details and everything. I think it was well worth it. Once I finished up all of the final details of the model and got the rig working well, I started working on different poses. There are a ton of amazing maned wolf photos out there, so it was really easy to find a lot of really interesting poses that I could recreate with this model. The first pose that I'm working on here is possibly a flying maned wolf, but really he's just jumping, maybe pouncing on prey in a savanna or grasslands. maned wolves are thought to have developed these really long legs as an adaptation to living among tall grasses. I'm sure it helps them see above the grass, see prey scurrying around on the ground, stuff like that. But yeah, there are great photos and videos of them kind of leaping over and pouncing down into the ground. It's really cute, so I knew I had to make a pose like that. The next pose is from a truly unreal photo of a maned wolf standing up on their hind legs, I think trying to reach some wolf apples. Maned wolves eat a ton of this fruit that kind of looks like a tomato, kind of looks like an apple. Their diet can be made up of anywhere from 40 to even up to 70% wolf apples in some cases. I thought that they grew on like shorter kind of trees, like they were closer to the ground. I would have thought that they were, you know, maybe a fruit of choice for maned wolves because they're easier to access, but maybe sometimes they grow up higher and our maned wolf friend has to just kind of walk around like a little man to get up to them. Another pose I really liked comes from this photo of two maned wolves. I think they're just playing in a zoo exhibit. Maned wolves are so goofy looking, but at the same time they're really striking and elegant, and I wanted to make sure that I recreated a pose that kind of honors how powerful they can be when they want to be. This is also a time where the having ears that are separate from the body mesh that can be really flexible and expressive comes very much in handy. Another interesting thing about maned wolves is that a lot of people, like with canines, wolves, domesticated dogs, like we kind of associate them with being very social and having that kind of pack hierarchy. But an interesting thing I learned about maned wolves is that they just don't really have social structures similar to that. They're actually very solitary. So even a mated pair of maned wolves, like one description called them loosely monogamous, but a pair of mated maned wolves, like they really won't interact with each other very much aside from, you know, rearing pups in their one estrus cycle per year when they might have pups. I just think that's so interesting. Like it keeps coming up over and over again with different animals that I've been modeling and talking about on the channel, like shoebill storks, elephant shrews. They're all animals that, again, are either pretty monogamous or loosely monogamous, like our friend maned wolf, but they just don't spend much time around each other. I just think that's really interesting. Once I finished making these different poses for my model, I knew that I wanted to make a pose sheet to show them off a little bit. And the first thing I needed to do, of course, was to model a wolf apple for our maned wolf. Obviously, how evil would I be if I posed our maned wolf reaching up for a wolf apple without modeling a wolf apple that he can actually reach? This year, I've been trying to do more rigging and animation and pose sheets, character sheets, all kinds of stuff with my models, so I knew that once I got this model finished and made these poses, I would want to make this pose sheet to show them off with, but I always struggle to format things like pose sheets. Graphic design is not a strength of mine. I recently learned that while making designs for some giant isopod washi tape that I'm working on. But anyway, my brain struggles to have ideas when it comes to graphic design, so I spend a lot of time putting together Pinterest boards of things like old game manuals, strategy guides, old Nintendo magazine ads, stuff like that for inspiration, basically. I eventually got the idea to maybe format my pose sheet like it was a fake game guide. I thought it would be fun to put something like that together, plus an interesting way to share actual information about the animal. This layout copies pretty directly from the manual for Dragon Warrior Monsters 2, a 2001 Game Boy game that I have never played, but I found lots and lots of scans of the game's manual on Pinterest, and it was also the only one that I felt like I could probably recreate the layout in Photoshop. I'd like to learn how to make graphics like this look like they're actually scanned glossy magazine paper, if that makes sense, like how to make them look a bit older, kind of aged, stuff like that. I just think it would be interesting. If there are any super Eye Patch Wolf fans watching today, his most recent video was actually about fake games like this, and I was really inspired to try it out. Making a guide for a game that does not exist, The Great Canids, I called it, was actually a really great way to get my mind just kind of thinking about what you would actually do in a Game Boy game where you play as different types of wild canines vying for territory. It was fun to think about my models in that context, like what abilities would they have, how would they move, what advantages would they have, that kind of thing. Maned wolf vocalizations. Maned wolves have a very unique vocalization called a roar bark. It's difficult to describe and do it justice, but here's a clip from the Endangered Wolf Center. It's not quite a howl, not quite a bark, kind of a drawn out yelling, barking sound. Roar bark is an excellent name for their call, and you can find even better clips of them doing that vocalization here on YouTube. The LA Zoo wrote that maned wolves primarily communicate via scent marking, but they will roar bark to their mate to let them know where they are or to ward off other maned wolves from their territory. It seemed natural that eating wolf apples would restore the maned wolf's health, but then I had the idea that maybe if your maned wolf was at full health but still ate a wolf apple, it would add something like XP to a gold mode meter. What gold mode would actually entail, I'm not sure, but I got the idea for gold mode from the maned wolf's Latin name, which translates to golden dog with a short tail. My last project for this model was to design 2 maned wolf papercrafts for Sneepsnorp Club. This video is already quite long, so I thought I'd just show the modeling process for the larger papercraft, which I really love. Again, I'm really glad that I rigged this model so I can make different poses really easily. I decided to go with this kind of relaxed walking pose for the big papercraft. The model really came together pretty easily. I started with just a cube and extruded out the legs without much dimension to them. Switching from global to normal orientation, I found, really helped me avoid twisty kind of polygons and non-planar faces when I'm making papercrafts. And that's something that generally it's good to avoid in 3D modeling, but particularly for papercrafts, I try to avoid that because anytime you have these non-flat kind of faces, it means that the paper will definitely have to bend or curve, which makes the model less balanced and stable, but that will always happen to some extent when you're folding paper, but avoiding them makes it much less of a problem later on. Papercraft designs are also always a lot of fun because they're the lowest poly version I'll usually ever make of every model, and it really forces me to make decisions about what is and isn't important to the model. Like each of these legs, I think only has a loop cut where the actual joints are in the leg. I have started using triangles more than just quads for papercrafts, again because they're just a stronger shape, so they make the papercraft model cleaner to build and more stable and balanced in the end. But triangles also allow me to create somewhat rounded areas like in the shoulders and in the hips and on the face, the cheeks. And here is the finished big maned wolf pattern. I really love how he turned out. I also made a mini version with these modular legs so you can make the impossibly tall creature as tall as you can possibly imagine. A huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel over on Sneepsnorp Club. We do monthly papercrafts, stickers, live streams, all kinds of stuff. You can find the link in the description, and you can join for as little as $1 a month if you'd like to support the channel. I also finally started 3D printing, so let me know in the comments if that's something y'all want to see or hear about in future videos. Oh, and the next video is about orchid mantises. Bye!